Bonjour, welcome everybody. I saw some really wonderful welcomes in the chat. Thank you all for joining us tonight. As everybody jumps on the call here, I want to welcome everybody. I want to bring us all together with good minds, good hearts, and good spirits. Today, in honor of National Aboriginal Day, we wanted to have our event today so that everyone can have the opportunity, our wonderful guests here, to have the opportunity to be with their families and their communities during Aboriginal Day tomorrow. So we're getting our celebration started off early tonight by starting today. So welcome everybody. I want to introduce to you tonight, we have a really exciting group with us that we're going to be bringing together some of the most inspiring Indigenous women's leadership across this nation, who I know I have personally been mentored, been inspired by these women. We're bringing together Courtney Montour, Senator Lillian Dyck, Dr. Pam Palmater, Sharon McIvor, and Jeanette Corbiere Lavell. And we're going to have some short videos from some special guests as well. So welcome everybody for tonight's event on how Indigenous women leaders have been resisting discrimination, have been leading our people, bringing us together for the good of all of our communities, for the good of our nations, bringing together for the future of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and all those 7 generations moving forward, in honor of all those 7 generations that came before us, who led in their own way and made us the women we are. So thank you everybody for coming today. I want to acknowledge that here at Trent University, where I'm located, we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, and we are very honored to have the ability to live and work and share this land at the blessing of the Mississauga peoples. And it has been a great honor to be able to share this land here that we're located on the Otonabee River in the territory of the Mississauga peoples. So I'd like to ask if Jeanette Corbiere Lavell can join us for some opening words for our opening prayer. Perfect.
Zibe, Kinway got to in Mumpy. Mame the gay got wonder the months of Chick Mumpy a king. After what is not got none good known. Kinway wim Quenmandor, Bidishno go estuary. Qui Zendame, me no quick can da an amanda and come go coda. Can you go and the gay no gabber shitchiad, meet the snugomanda as you could send them on. How? Me go chenda medash. Shum sananik no crusanic do them in a gay no, but you may go be shy. Not a motion on way and it's gig down me no. Chick can't among any getting shitchian pee me no. How? Me watch the shemdo. Me watch.
Now, Chmiigwech, Jeanette. So we're going to start off today with our video, a short clip from the video on one of the women who has inspired me greatly, is our video on Mary Tuak's Earley, I Am an Indian Again.
I had a vision that I one day would be free again, to be an Indian.
I married a white man in 1938, and yet there's that law that you're not Indian anymore when you marry a non-Indian. We lose our right to vote here, we lose our property.
Our numbers will shrink and shrink and shrink, and really it's about our extinction.
Something I said, we've got to do something.
Imagine, Mary, these recordings have gone untouched for over 30 years.
This is the first time we have ever been able to speak. We demand that the Indian Act be changed to give us equal rights.
You and your sisters In a sense, you're equal when you think you're equal. And if you think you're unequal, the law won't change much.
A law can make your own brother discriminate against you, like he's Indian and you're not.
My mother became notorious. That's when she started getting the death threats.
You have to know the politicians. Oh, God. Politics. It's wicked.
Please search your hearts and minds. Set my sisters free. Set my sisters free.
This is such a powerful, powerful moment to hear her voice, to see Mary again. And I'd like to ask Courtney Montour if you could come and share with us why you chose Mary as the subject for your documentary. I mean, it's so clear to me, but if you can come online and share with us that legacy, the legacy of Mary 2 Acts Earley. I still remember sitting in Montreal, in a hotel in Montreal. I had gone to a conference, and that was back in the day when I was a film student, and I had brought along an old video camera, and I set it up, and I set up Jeanette and Mary, and they just talked about those days back in the 70s when they got together, when there was nobody speaking for the women, and how they had to come together. And it's not that our women don't have a voice. Our women are strong and they have such a powerful voice, but it was that nobody was listening. So if you, I will turn it over to you to share the legacy and what inspired you.
Yeah, well, for having me, Dawn. I mean, it's such an honor to be here and to remind people of Mary's story and her voice. She was Kanien'kehá, Mohawk from Kahnawake, the same community that I'm from. So I grew up always hearing of her name, but there's not that much information out there across the country, in our school systems. And to me, she's a role model because she challenged Canada, for the rights of First Nations women and children, and this issue of sex discrimination, Indian status being taken away from women who married non-Indigenous men. And it's something that so many people in our communities have gone through. And like I said, there's just not enough out there on her story. So that was really the driving force on me to want to make this film on Mary 2 Acts Earley. She's someone we should all know. She was pivotal in the women's rights movement. And to me, it's really concerning that it's almost a hidden history. That's how I see it.
Thanks, Courtney. And this is what happens when I get too excited about the film and hearing Mary's voice again. I didn't even give you a chance to introduce yourself to everybody tonight, because tonight is about sharing our stories as Indigenous women. So I'll ask you if you can share a little bit of your story and introduce yourself, please.
Yes, so I'm Courtney Montour. I'm the writer and director of Mary 2 Acts Earley, I Am Indian Again. I'm also Kanien'kehá from Kahnawake, and a filmmaker working mainly on documentaries on Indigenous issues and identity. I think identity spans so greatly over so many of the issues that we face every day. And that's really what brought me to Mary's story. It's such a rich part of our identity and Indian status, and the Canadian government being the ones to determine who has Indian status. And so many people who are going to be on this conversation today are key figures in that movement. And again, I just feel like our Indigenous women, our First Nations women, the role they've played in this is so huge. Mary is a pivotal figure in Canadian history, yet there's not that much out there about her. So to me, that's really key to bring these voices forward.
And that's why it's so important what you've done. I know, for me, I had the honor of being able to sit with Mary, being able to hear her and hear her in person. And there's so many now that wouldn't be able to have that chance in these future generations. I think of our daughters and granddaughters and children moving forward. And so your work is so critical, so important to make sure that her story and her voice is heard to keep inspiring those future generations. Thank you so much, Courtney, for coming in and bringing this. And we are going to have some time for questions. at the end with everybody. At this point, we actually have another short video to turn to for two more amazing, powerful leaders in our movement. Two women that have inspired me greatly as I was growing up, inspired me for the last 47 years, seeing these women taking on the government of Canada, taking on legislation, to be able to reclaim our place in our communities, to allow their children to reclaim our rightful place, belonging in our communities. And we can turn over to a short clip with Senator Lillian Dyck and Dr. Jeanette Corbiere Lavell.
Oh, Jeanette, it's so good to be sitting beside you. She is an incredible trailblazer. I'd heard about her when I was first studying the status issue and getting my status back, and couldn't believe that Canada, the Supreme Court, had a split decision and ruled against her.
Yeah.
I thought it was so obvious that there was something wrong, but I never had the opportunity to meet you until Bill S3 arrived in the Senate. As part of the strategy, there were a number of press conferences, and you, of course, you were there, and Dawn, and Sharon, and Pam. And there's just something about you. She is this tiny woman, beautiful woman with beautiful energy, and just calming and so knowledgeable. And it was such an honor to be at those press conferences with you and to help you achieve what you started so long ago. And to when the bill actually was finally amended and enacted, it must have been such a thrill for you, because it was a thrill for me.
If we go back, it's all sort of rolled up into one big story. But I just want to say, me, Gwech, for all those nice things you said.
Oh, you're welcome, my dear.
I get overwhelmed at times, when people I've met come up and they'll talk to me. But when something comes up like that barrier or anything, then it's different. Then you get that energy and you just want to go and do something. Yeah.
And we were talking about this earlier. It shows that a group action's necessary, and it shows that how long it takes as well, because the number of women involved to convince our government to do the right thing.
Well, when you think about it, it's even longer. I keep saying it's 52 years because that's when I started the challenge, and that's the year that I was married. But prior to that, other women, like Mary Tuaxer, she was already trying to find a way to rectify, take that section out. And then other women at the community level, because on my reserve, the chief's daughter was in the same situation. And he kept saying, well, we're doing it internally within the bureaucracy to make a change. So this whole challenge of getting our women recognized, because the men too, they wanted to keep the women there and be part of the community. So this is just whole idea of like a genocide, just take a group of people out of the community, especially the women, because women, of course, are the center of the family and the community. But then there has to be that balancing. So that was why it was so important, thinking about that happening now. And all those women across Canada, and many of them have passed on, like Mary. Well, of course, we're getting up in age now, so it's bound to happen, but never know.
So did you know Mary Tuaxer?
Yes. I would say she was one of my role models, because she was just so calm, and she wasn't very tall like me. And she was Mohawk. And she started coming to different gatherings and meetings and talk really gently. And she would say, all I want is to be able to go home, return to my people, and be buried with my ancestors. and that was the key thing for her. And speaking to others, for me too, that you know, I can't think of myself anywhere else. That's my home. That's who I am, and all my ancestors are there. Like on my mom's side, my dad's side.
It's interesting you brought up the burial, because that's what struck me too when I heard her or watched some of the videos on her. Because my mother died in 1956 after she lost her status, and she's buried in a little town, Killam, Alberta. And later on in life, I thought, well, maybe I should have her moved back to the reserve. And then when I watched Mary Tuak's Earley, I realized she could not have been buried on the reserve because she was no longer status.
Yeah, yeah.
Which really indicates how detailed the Indian Act is to even state you can't be buried on the reserve unless you have status.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, eh?
Yeah.
Well, I believe it's time we did our own governance and put our own people with our own perspective.
Yep.
For our people, the young ones coming, they have to get their language back, you know, within our own teaching and education. Because in our language, we have that, a different way of thinking. We revert to traditional thing, Indigenous thinking, whatever we want to call it. But it's different compared to the Shagna-Shimwin, like the English speaking, yeah. So it's thinking about all that, and we need to really start remembering that, and then we can work together, and we can be stronger. And Indian Act, I don't suppose it'll happen in our lifetimes, but I would like to see it disappear and have our own people in charge, you know, in all aspects. This is our land, all of Canada, and they haven't adequately really recognized or compensated for it. Yeah.
You know, it was interesting when you're talking about language and culture, and Dr. King, who had the great pleasure to know. But, you know, I was so disconnected from everything growing up as a kid. But yet, there is something that is inherited, like the spiritual part of who we are.
Yeah.
And always as a child, I'm a dreamer. I have these amazing dreams. And I never really knew that that was part of my identity.
Like visions in your dreams,
yeah. And I became a scientist, so I had to ignore all that. But then when I started to pay attention, I felt much better.
Yeah.
Because I got that
different
gift.
way of thinking, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good, really good to hear. And Anishinaabe Nation, we have a way of assisting and helping. Because what the Anishinaabe Nation, what we're doing, because I'm part of that now, is if anyone can trace their ancestry on either side, their mom or their dad's side, back to someone who's Indigenous, or they can just follow it, then that's all that's needed. Then you are recognized by the Anishinaabe Nation.
You never
no
give
paper.
up, do you? You just keep doing all these wonderful things.
Well, little things, it all comes together, it helps. Don't get me on treaties now, that's something else.
Okay, we're not going to talk about that.
No.
So we now have our ideas for the next video series event we're going to have. We'll have one about treaties and one about visions. I'm jotting down some really powerful things that are coming out of this conversation. I want to invite one of my personal heroes, Senator Lillian Dyck, to join us on the screen here and share your story with us. If you could introduce yourself, and one of my own personal heroes that I can only hope someday to follow your lead, and maybe I'll even be in the Senate someday.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lillian Eva Dyck. Eva was my mom's name, so I always like to use Eva in honor of my mother, and certainly has been my mother. And I know you know this as well, Dawn, my mother's been my inspiration and motivation to keep going no matter what. I was originally a neuroscientist at the University of Saskatchewan, and then out of the blue in 2005, I was summoned to the Senate by the former Prime Minister Paul Martin, and I served in the Senate until August 2020 for 15 and a half years. And while I was there, my priority areas were mostly to do with Indigenous issues, particularly violence against Indigenous women, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and then later on, the status issue, the loss of status by the descendants of Indian women who lost their status, like your mother, due to marriage to non-Indians. And of course, that happened to me in our family because my mother married a Chinese man, and as a consequence, she lost her status. And my brother and I grew up off reserve, and were really, she inherited the shame of being an Indian because she was a survivor of Indian residential schools. So we were brought up by our mother to be ashamed of who we were and to try and hide that. And eventually I came to grips with that and embraced my Cree culture and have felt much better since that. Now in the Senate, there are sort of two areas that I want to talk very briefly about. One is to do with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I had my own private member's bill that would have made it an aggravating factor if someone abused an Indigenous woman. Unfortunately, the government would not support that, the Liberal government. And however, I was able to amend another government bill in the last couple of years to essentially incorporate into the criminal code the same kind of provisions. And so what happened there was that we added in a section to the objectives in sentencing that would make it essentially an aggravating factor, so that when in cases of abuse, when the victim was a female or an Aboriginal person, then denunciation and deterrence were key factors, primary considerations that the judge must take into account. So that's equivalent to an aggravating factor. Mm-hmm. And then the second amendment that was introduced and added to what I had originally proposed, actually by the government themselves, they put in a whole new section to the criminal code called additional considerations. And what they did was basically what it says, that in cases of intimate partner violence, the judge must consider the increased vulnerability of female victims, particularly Aboriginal female victims. So these are historic changes because the criminal code up to this point does not mention the word women, and it does not mention Indigenous or Aboriginal women in particular. So hopefully these changes will begin to start changing the way the general public and the way that the men who are abusing women and Indigenous women will start to realize the consequences will be severe and adequate. So I was very pleased that I was able to get those changes incorporated in 2019 near the end of my term. And then around about the same time, we received from the government Bill S3, which had to do with restoring status to the descendants of Indian women who lost their status by marriage to non-Indian men. We say lost status, but in fact, it was Canada who revoked it or took it away. And in fact, what Canada was doing was what Jeanette just said, was it was like a genocide. It was taking away our right to our culture. So I've grown up not really knowing my culture, not knowing my language, not knowing anything about what it meant to be a Cree woman. So that was official government policy. When the bill came to the Senate, the department officials kept telling us they had removed all sex-based discrimination in the Indian Act against registration of Indians. But it became very clear to us that that was not the case. They weren't telling us the truth. They were feeding us something that their interpretation, and they kept saying it no matter how many times we said to them, this is not true because of what the witnesses have said to us. Now, at the time, I was the chair of the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, and as the chair, I had a certain amount of ability to decide how this bill was going to go, and I had a certain amount of power. So the very first thing we did, which has, as far as I have heard, which has never been done before, is that we decided we would suspend study of the bill, that we sent it back to the government and said, this bill is not good enough. You must amend it to fulfill the promises you made, that you were removing all sex-based discrimination. And so we sent it back to them. To make a long story short, they refused until the very final end, and that it essentially became a standoff between the Senate and the House of Commons. But eventually the government caved in, and in June 2019, the government leader in the Senate adjourned the debate on the bill, and over the summer, the federal government finally sat down and came forth with the appropriate amendments. And I should also say that prior to that, there was an amendment proposed, I believe it was crafted by Sharon McIvor, Pam Palmater, Sheila Day, and Gwen Brodsky from FAIA. The Senate introduced an amendment, and the government also rejected that. So clearly the government did not want to do the right thing. And it was only by taking a principled stand, having the allies like Jeanette and yourself as president of ONWA, the president of the Quebec Native Women's Association, all the different groups coming together and saying, you know, enough is enough. It's time to do the right thing. We're not going to proceed. The Senate is going to stand here and say, this is that was 2019. It's time for this to end, because it had been 150 years since that policy started. It started back in 1869, even before the Indian Act was enacted. It started in 1869. So eventually the government did cave. They did the bill in two phases, and the removal of the ability of descendants that were affected by the 1951 cutoff, that piece came into effect in August 2019. And I don't like to brag or anything, but you know, I felt so honored and humbled to be part of this, because you know, it was just the right time, with all the right people, with all the previous work, with support in the Senate, being able to draw all the different parties in the Senate together. We all stood fast. We kept passing motions as the Senate as a whole to say it's time to reenact phase 2. And lo and behold, in August 2019, they did. And I still can't believe it happened. I believe the government is to some extent dragging their feet on getting the registration going, because there's potentially hundreds of thousands of descendants who are entitled to be registered. But the information that's up on the web is not helpful. So people don't even know this has happened. People don't even know how they're eligible. They've made it way, way too complicated. I think, you know, having the allies was so important, having the different Indigenous women's organizations and having FAIA, the Feminist Alliance for International Action, because they did a lot of press releases. We in the Senate did press releases. The public pressure was there. The unions were on side. So we had just enormous public support. All that was necessary to move what was at least a supportive government. So we had the chance, and amazingly enough, we got it done.
Well, and I think what you're saying, you know, the importance of those allies, the importance of making this an everybody's issue, not just an Indigenous women's issue, you know, recognizing that this impacts all of our nations, all of our people.
Yes.
These are our children.
Yes. And when everybody prospers, all of Canada prospers, right? Because unfortunately, a lot of the descendants had to move off reserve And oftentimes, you know, what it's like, you're facing racism, you're facing sexism. It's difficult to make your way and to rise out of that, rise out of poverty, rise out of, the intergenerational trauma. It's much more difficult when you're on your own, living in a society that doesn't really accept you. So it's going to have really a tremendous effect. And I'm really glad that this video is being produced, because I think it's important for people to know what's going on, to know our history, and to know what their rights are.
And I think with that actually is a perfect segue into one of the people who has been instrumental in helping help on this movement, helping us get the awareness out there on what our rights are. If we can invite Dr. Pam Palmater to join us to share some of your thoughts and comments, as somebody who I'm sure you are just itching to comment on this notion that we somehow just lost our status as if it was misplaced, like my glasses or my pen, which I can't seem to find here, or even, that they weren't telling the truth when they're telling us that this has been dealt with, that there's, no backlog in registration, when we know I can get a passport in 24 hours if an emergency, but it's going to take 2 years to process a status application. So I would like to welcome Dr. Pam Palmater, one of my favorite people and co-conspirators in a lot of the actions we get up to around here. And also one of my favorite heroes to join us. And please introduce yourself for those of you who don't know as well as I do.
Kwe Nindaluizi, Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded Mi'kmaqi, and my home community is Ugbaganjig, which is Eel River Bar First Nation. And this has got to be one of my favorite events because all of my heroes are on here. All of the heroes that can be are on this importantly incredible issue. And, thank you, Dawn. You're just being so gracious to everyone when we're all just thinking the exact same thing about you.
Thanks, Pam. So what can you share with all of, especially the young people out there who are coming up, watching us, lead the way on, the importance of taking a stand, the importance of speaking out, and, how your perspectives on how the law is specifically impacting the lives of Indigenous women, historically and in contemporary contexts. Because some people say, we should just throw out the Indian Act, and yet, to pretend that the Indian Act is not defining and impacting our lives, and that we have to address the return, the belonging of all of our children and grandchildren before we can start having those larger conversations.
Exactly. And the point you raise is so important. You can't just go and commit centuries of genocide against a people and then say, oh yeah, you get to start, but only from here. You don't get to bring any of your other people back. You don't get to rebuild your nations. You only get to start from, this tiny amount of what you used to be. I mean, it just flies in the face of anything even related to reconciliation. And I think the thing I want younger people to understand, or people that are just actually coming to this issue, even if they're not younger, is that we can never take this for granted, that this is literally decades and decades and decades of work by Indigenous First Nations women, in fact, who haven't given up. And although I didn't know Mary Tuax personally, I didn't know Yvonne Bedard, I didn't know your mom my whole life, I only knew Sandra Lovelace later in life and Sharon McIvor later, they are literally our grandmothers. When you think about what is a grandmother in many of our cultures, and you look at all of these grandmothers, like in our Mi'kmaq Nation, for example, and they're taking in all of these kids whose parents have passed away, or kids from another community that, have been disenfranchised. They just take them all in and they care for them and they advocate for them. They're literally their number one warrior. And all of these women have literally fulfilled that role for me. I wouldn't even be registered. I wouldn't be a part of my community were it not for all of these grandmothers. And the thing that gets me the most is that That's the same for my children. The fact that in my lifetime, I was able to see my children be a part of my community is something you can't buy, you can't replace. And all I can say is I hope I do a fraction of the work and impact that they've all done to make sure that my grandkids and my great-grandkids don't have to go through any of this. And there's also so many unsung heroes, right? You know, look at Mary 2X Earley, what Courtney was saying. Her history has been effectively erased. You know, hardly anyone knows about it. And not everyone is going to know the names of all of the warriors, but around all of us, there have been a tight network of women and community members and elders all working together to try to keep pushing these issues forward, because it means the survival of our nations. Ultimately, we are returning women and children is effectively the antidote to centuries of genocide. And that's good for us. It's good for Canada as a country. It's good for the planet, in fact, because who's on the front lines defending our lands and waters and protecting it from environmental contamination? It's women. You know, our voices have been silenced through this legislation, and these grandmothers have given us our voices back in a context where sometimes even our own people didn't want it back. You know, when Canadian courts didn't want us to have it back. So I think it's so important to remember them and to think about them and how hard that was, and not take any of that stuff for granted, because this is how we combat all of the ill impacts of genocide.
And I think, you know, this is absolutely the most important thing. Our nations are about our people, are about our children, our grandchildren. I mean, we've been around those tables where people want to talk about treaty rights, where we want to talk about economic development. But if we don't have our people, if we don't have anybody to exercise those rights, then it becomes a meaningless argument. And that's what this is all about, this whole challenge from the beginning. So I want to bring in now one more of our heroes who has walked beside us through the streets of Washington in the pouring rain, downtown Manhattan, as we're getting blown away, coming together to bring this issue to the forefront, leading those court challenges. I'd like to introduce you to one more of my heroes. This is a really powerful day for me. And there's so many women here that I am just so proud to know, and who have really helped to guide me and to lead this struggle, to lead this fight, to lead these challenges. So Sharon McIvor, if you can join us.
It's been a long time. We've been at this for a long, long time. And what we all contributed and how we move forward is really important. And of course, it's important to have us record this. So even when we're no longer to participate, you can grab a video somewhere and find out what the heck we were doing back then. And so my story is very much like many people's stories. I'm non-status. I wasn't able to participate. Actually, I was able to participate when we started the case, or we're preparing our case for trial, the McIvor case. One of the things that my good friend Gwen Brodsky did was she made me tell my story to her. And so it made me think of everything that had happened up to the point where we were at, and all of the opposition and all of the ugly stuff, Indigenous woman who is exposed to a non-Indigenous society. And so we had an interesting time, me remembering and her writing down and all of that. But and it was painful, really, really, really painful to not only talk about it to Gwen, who was a good friend, but then to turn around and have it go public, you know, with the documents that we filed and all of that. But I think what's really most important, and something that I've done throughout the time I've done it, is it's about our rights. It's a birthright we have. You know, we're not asking the government to give us something that doesn't belong to us. We're asking them to stop blocking what belongs to us. And so for me, that is really important. As most of you know, today I'm sitting in my chair in my home in the heart of my Kanien'kehá territory. I've lived here my entire life, and I've never had a home outside of here. I've gone out for education and out for work and all of that, but this is my home, and this is where I'm most comfortable. When we do the work, and we're talking about even today, because we're seeing that the AFN is having a little bit of difficulty. When we did the work for recognition of our women's organization, the ONWA case against Canada, we had the men solidly against us, on record, solidly against us. And not only solidly against us, when we were caught in a place where we were by ourselves, they were very aggressive and attacked us. I know Jeanette has always been generous when she talks about getting us back together, and we want our communities to make the decision. We have a lot of communities that the men in our communities will not allow us to participate. I know for me, when I was when we started the ONWA case, and we would still attend the constitutional rounds, but we wouldn't be able to go in, you know, when the ceremony was over and the opening was over. Everybody that wasn't certified as being consulted or consulting with the government was kicked out of the room. And I can remember being in the Royal York Hotel in Toronto, and we were there and we were kicked out of the room, and I was walking across the lobby to go back up to my room, and these two men from the two of the four organizations that were opposing our application to be a part of or being consulted as an individual women's group stopped me in the middle of the lobby. And they were big, tall, strong men, and they started yelling at me and saying that I had no right to call them male chauvinist pigs. And I was thinking, I don't think that was in the documentation. It's what they interpreted, I think. But anyway, but it was scary, because one would yell at me and the other would yell at me, and they were getting closer and closer. And the one thing I refused to do was back up. So I stood there, and they were standing over me, and I was looking at him when he talked and him when he talked, and they were close enough that they were actually spitting on me when they were yelling. And my thought, what I really wanted to do was to cry, but that wasn't going to happen right there. But I didn't know how to get out of it. And my friend Teresa Nahaney, that most of you know, she came out of the room and saw what was going on, and she wasn't having any part of that. She went way against the wall to make sure that she went around us, and she headed for the elevator. And I said to Teresa, "Oh, there you are. I've been waiting for you. Sorry, guys, I've got to go." And I went, elevator door closed, and I burst into tears. But anyway, there is that level of hostility out there, and there still is that level of hostility. And as much as we, you know, always try to stroke and enjoy the few victories we've had, we've still got a lot of stuff to do out there. So my role has been a lot of the consistent legal work, and it's not me, it's me and my friends, my little circle with Gwen and Sheila. We did a lot of the work. Sheila's an expert at the UN, so I went along with her, and we were able to do the international work. Gwen is really good at the drafting and, you know, turning my story into something that the judge could understand and all of that. So, and there's still a lot of work to be done. I know that each time I meet someone, and this work has made me notorious, because I don't know how many times I've met somebody and they'll ask me if I'm the Sharon McIvor. There are thousands of people out there that are entitled and don't know, and they're not making it very easy to find out. So my approach is, it's our birthright. We were born with the birthright of being able to belong to our communities and enjoy the language and culture and all of that. And they didn't have the right to take it away. And they've suspended it for as long as they could, and they're still suspending it. So I know that there's a lot of work to be done, and having other people know about it, and hope allies are always good. We've got a good group of allies, but I think that's all I need to say.
Thanks, Sharon. And I'm really glad you brought up Sheila Day and Gwen Brodsky, two that were absolutely instrumental, amazing, fabulous supporters. I can't tell you how many times I had to call Sheila and I would forget about the time difference. So I was probably calling her at 6 o'clock in the morning with some question that I needed some support on moving this forward. And so they were absolutely instrumental, and certainly couldn't have done it without them and without you. But I think you bring a really good point to this conversation, which is that it's not enough to quietly slip a little link onto the government website without telling everybody that they do have this right now, that there's so many. I mean, there was no big press release, no big education campaign, that our women and the children and grandchildren and our grandmothers are able to reclaim our place in our communities, to reclaim our status. And, maybe there's a class action suit out there for some of these women who have spent their entire lives trying to reclaim what was rightfully ours, what was rightfully theirs. Women like Jeanette and Lillian, who didn't just somehow lose their status the same way we lose a pen or a pair of eyeglasses. It was taken away. And what has the harm been over generations because of that act, and because of the dragging of their feet on the removing the discrimination, because of even right now, as we have websites that say it could be up to 2 years to have somebody reinstated. How is that not discrimination against our people? So I think you've given us a lot of food for thought here on what some of the next areas are. And I want to thank you so much, Sharon, for being here. And I want to ask Jeanette to join us now to share some thoughts with us, Jeanette, on what this has all meant over the last 50 years. When I think about, I was, 13 years old in a high school English class, and my English teacher, when he heard my name, and he said, well, would you happen to know, like, there was a famous woman, a Jeanette Corbiere Lavell. And I said, yeah, I see her sometimes, that's my mom. I think at that point you were working for the government. So, you were traveling a lot. Thanks so much for the woman who has inspired all of us that are here on this call today. In honor of your 80th birthday and 50 years of struggle and standing up and fighting for the rights of not just you and your children and grandchildren, but for our communities, for our nations. I'd like to ask if you can share some thoughts on, did it turn out the way you expected? Was it worth it in the end? As Sharon talked about, as Lillian talked about, as Mary Tuax talked about, those threats, those hardships, was it worth it all in the end? And, maybe help explain for those of us who don't know about the Anishinaabeg concept of that belonging, of our right to belong, those who belong. So, but let's start with the first one is, did this, when you decided to go to court way back in the 70s, did it go the way you expected?
When I look back and think about it, I honestly didn't have any concept of the amount of animosity that would come my way. It was just so unbelievable. And it even started in my own community. To me, it was such a simple idea, simple question. This is where, like with Pemkong unceded territories, where I was born, brought up, went to school there, and from there went to North Bay for high school, but I didn't have anywhere else. So to have that part of who I am, my identity, taken away in April of 1970, when I received that letter saying, Jeanette Corbiere, you are no longer a member of Whetung Reserve at that point. I just couldn't believe it. So thinking back, yes, definitely, it has been worth it. All the energy that we had to use, and you know, when I think about it, the value of all that was getting to meet all the other women across Canada who were in the same position that I was. And they started contacting me when we lost at the first level, which was the county court. You know, the judge there said, I don't know why you're upset, you know, with losing your status. Who wants to be a member of a reserve anyways? But people didn't understand, like, belonging. These are my people. And Mary Tuak said she just wanted to be buried with her people. And we talk about it when you talk about going home. Well, where do you go? You go back to your home community. When you talk about your relatives, where do you come from? When you meet someone, the first thing you ask is, and where are you from? And they'll say, well, I'm from up north, from the Sioux Lookout area, from, you know, from this reserve here. And then you make that sense of connection. So it has been worth it, really. And now I can look back and say, yes, there's thousands of our women and children and men in all the various aspects, you know, the ones who are enfranchised or not on their own volition, but maybe their husband enfranchised, so they were, you know, lost their rights as well. There's so many aspects to what the government did in this Indian Act, this legislation, that it's bewildering at times to see all the different aspects of it. And I believe it was genocide. It was done deliberately, right from the very beginning. But here we are now in this day and age, and we're still struggling. We still have to say, we do this court case, we do the other court case. Like, I lost at the Supreme Court of Canada, just because of a lot of the opposition, the political situation. And of course, the judges, they're not immune. They hear, and lost by one vote. And then Sharon, you know, her struggles, and because she wasn't totally recognized either, she had to go to the UN to get rights for her grandchildren. And then we get to the last one there, the Sheno case, and that's for the grandchildren of the women who lost their status. So it's ongoing. But you asked me, has it been worth it? Yes, it has. And I believe that sense of belonging, and in the Anishinaabe Nation, we say, the Bendaugsame, we belong. This is who we are. These are our people. And we have our own law now within the Anishinaabe Nation, and it's called Kanien'kehá, our law for those who belong. And we want to get the word out. We are part of our communities and our families, and we can make so many contributions. I even look at my own family and how much they're doing for our people. Like you're working, you're a professor, you're at Trent. My son, Nimki, he's doing land-based teaching. So he's contributing to the community. And my youngest son, he's over in Europe right now, and he's heading to the Ukraine to go help the refugees. I mean, you're all doing marvelous things and to help our people. And of course, it has been worth it. But I do hope that before I leave this beautiful world of ours here, our territory, that I can say that we are truly belonging to our communities and that we have those doors open. Sharon mentioned some reserves will not accept us. Well, we're going to have to deal with that, and we have to make them change their minds and recognize we have so much to offer. You know, we're getting educated, we have technology, and we are part of all that. And all I see is hope, that vision, and those dreams. So I think I'll just close on that and say, most definitely it has been worth it. And all the friends I made in the meantime too, right across Canada, that has been really worthwhile.
Thank you so much. And I think I hear this word of visions coming forward again. So I think we're definitely going to take note for our next event, you know, inspired by Senator Lillian, Dyck, and Jeanette, and, you know, talking about those visions that we have, that the visions that our ancestors left with us to move forward, to carry forward. And that our women leaders have given us that vision, that strength to move forward. So we have Chief Emily Whetung was supposed to be joining us, but she was not able to. She's been called away to an important meeting. So she did send a short video that we'd like to play at this point.
I am so glad, Jeanette, to be able to wish you a happy 80th birthday. Meeting you this week was a highlight and like a dream come true, because I didn't even know that it was you, and you are absolutely one of those badass women who inspires me. Happy birthday.
Well, I'm happy to hear that Jeanette is turning 80. She looks incredible. My cousin was saying last night, we can't believe she's going to turn 80. She looks so lovely. And just don't ask me to sing happy birthday to her. I'm not a singer. But she was like at the forefront. I didn't meet Jeanette until I got to the Senate. And she challenged it way back in the late 60s and early 70s, led the way, along with people like Mary Two-Axe Earley, Jeanette taking the government of Canada to court, and then losing at the Supreme Court with a split vote. Like, and nowadays, if she took it now to court, she'd win. It's all about timing. And she's kept at it ever since. And clearly she's passed that legacy on to her family through Dawn, who's her daughter. If it hadn't been for her, we wouldn't be where we're at today. So she is definitely keeping the pressure on. And it was a thrill for me to be able to work with her when I was in the Senate and to be at press releases with her on the stage. It was a very honoring and humbling experience to work with all these women that I'd read about and heard about, and then suddenly, you know, because of my position in the Senate, to be with them. And so I wish her all the very best. And I know she's just going to keep creating change, if not through herself, but through her daughter and her granddaughter. And happy birthday, Jeanette. You're just such a gem.
I am feeling so grateful, and I'm so proud of all the young women now, you know, that I meet, the ones who are really listening to their families, their teachings, and learning that sense of identity. They know that they're Anishinaabe, and this is their people. This is where they come from. And they're starting to find out their history, what we had to go through. They see the role models. I think it's just so positive. And they're so beautiful and proud of who they are. And they want to learn. They want to get that language. They want to get that culture, that connection to the land. I'm so pleased. That's all I can say. and my next generation will continue.
Such powerful, powerful words. And so I think, as everybody can see in the chat, we are going to stay in this Zoom room for this meeting to carry on to the really exciting part of our event this afternoon. This is the question and answer portion. So people have been posting some questions. They're going to be coming into me, and I will be reading them off and asking each of our participants here to answer our questions. Thank you, everybody, so much. We are going to start tonight with our first comment from actually one of my favorite people, a very dear friend here in the Peterborough region, former Liberal MP and Cabinet Minister Miriam Monsef has sent in a question, first of all, to celebrate and wish Jeanette happy birthday and congratulate all of our women leaders here. But the question is, there were obviously setbacks throughout this struggle, losing in the Supreme Court, losing at various stages along the way. How did you each get back on your feet after a setback? What inspired you to keep going? So we'll start with Jeanette, and then we'll go through, and I'll call on each of you. So Jeanette.
Okay. Well, I think it's because I believed in it. I really wanted to be part of my family and my community, and I wasn't going to let this piece of paper say no, I couldn't, and even though technically they told me, oh, you're trespassing if you go back on the reserve, didn't matter, that they can arrest me, they can do whatever they want. But it was so important at the time, because that's who I am, that's where I belong. And I in the long run, because it's right, and it is our sovereign right. This is what our ancestors wanted when we think about it, why they signed those treaties, why they welcomed others to come into our territory, why our great chiefs, like Filmmaker and Sitting Bull, and even around here, Pontiac, they really wanted us as a nation of people to stick together and to recognize who we are, and our descendants as well, because you are part of our community, and that's what's important. So I guess that's all I can say about it. So, miigwech for asking me.
Thank you for the question. That's an interesting question. How do you recover from setbacks? And honestly, I know every woman here has had many in her lifetime. And in my worst setback, I can remember, literally crying my heart out walking down the street. And it was that point in time where I could literally feel my mother's spirit. And, getting in touch with that part of myself, with the spirituality, and knowing that I was fighting for what was right. I knew it was right. And even though all the people around me said, no, you're crazy, what you're asking for is ridiculous, you just have to keep going nonetheless. And depending on the particular issue, you may have friends who will lend you their ears and their hearts to help you keep going. Sometimes you smudge. Sometimes you don't have friends because it's a very issue that not everybody understands. But I think we all just have to reach down deep, deep, deep and reconnect with that Indigenous spirituality, and know that, I guess it's our ancestors, right? Behind us, our mothers and grandmothers and so on. And we just continue to do it nonetheless, despite all the animosity. And I think both Sharon and Jeanette talked about the male animosity. I have faced, just incredible animosity as well. But I always have to remind myself, they're only doing it because they're being mean and they're trying to keep you from doing what you're doing. And you can't allow them to do that. You are in the right path, and just to keep going.
Miigwech. And I think that's so critical, thinking about that reconnecting with our culture and our ancestors. and the importance of finding those opportunities, and for those of us here making those opportunities for the youth coming up. And we'll ask Sharon as well, what helped you to keep going and when you got the setbacks?
Well, it was all an interesting time, and there are various parts of it, but when we were going to go to court, this was in June of 2006, while it was inevitable we're going to get into the courtroom in the fall, the government of Canada changed their minds and decided that I had better status and my son could have status. And they wrote us a letter and told us that, and then said, so why don't we just give your son status, and the case will then be moot. We don't have to go forward. And, you know, this is a long haul. We started in 1989, we started, and this was 2006. And I think I never thought about it because my nature is I just push ahead regardless. But I thought I'd talk to my son because he was into, you know, he was getting older and he didn't have status and all of that. And it took him 30 seconds to say, no, Mom, no, I don't want my status if everybody else can't have it. And so just the drive, there were things that are not right. And everybody knows they're not right. And just because of the power base and that, they can get away with it. And I know that I couldn't live with myself if I just didn't keep moving ahead and trying to make things right. I solve problems. A fellow passenger on the airplane got into a situation, and I stepped in, didn't know who they were, but stepped in and solved the problem. I was born with this sense of fairness, and if I see something that's not right, is unfair, and it doesn't matter who it is, I will step in if I can help. And so the setbacks, Gwen and I talked about setbacks because both of us are lawyers, and when you get a case and you didn't win the case, and and Pam, there are a lot of cases that we should have won, we thought we should win, but we didn't. And so we would sort of sit back and lick our wounds a little bit and look at the case to see if there was anything in it that we could say, okay, that was a little movement. And so that helps if you've got people you can talk to and try to, you know, console each other and then get ready and start moving forward again. But I never ever thought, okay, I've had enough. I've never ever thought, okay, you know, I've done my piece. Now I'm going to go lay on the beach somewhere.
Pam, do you have some thoughts?
Well, I think this whole session could be called What She Said, because honestly, everything that everyone has said is why we do this. I mean, literally at its core, I don't know of a single First Nation or Native American government whose core traditional principles doesn't include justice for everybody. Like, we are collectives, we're in this for everybody. So as long as, you know, there can be no justice if there's only justice for us, but not for anybody else. And I look at where I am today, and I am thankful and grateful to all of the women on this panel and the ones who aren't, like Sandra Lovelace-Nicholas and Yvonne Bedard and like everybody else. Because they didn't give up, because Sharon McIvor refused to sell out, and she could have, right? Canada could have used all of the poverty and all of the dispossession and oppression and racism and sexism, and knows our vulnerabilities, and through no fault of our own, she could very well have sold out and said, well, you know what? I have needs right now. Imagine single moms with like 6 kids who are living in poverty. You know, is that selling out, or is that bowing to the oppression? And so she didn't. And because she didn't sell out, I am where I am today, and so are my children. So it's like, there is no defeat. There is no defeat. The defeat is when we see people that stop advocating, that don't care anymore, that do sell out. That's the defeat. But every time we go to court, that's a success, regardless of what the outcome is, because we are still there on the front lines fighting. And so I figure if they can do it, then I better be doing that for my kids and my grandkids. And, you know, it's kind of in line with like all my brothers and sisters. They were really politically active when I was little. And they always said, you don't have a right to call yourself Mi'kmaq unless you're prepared to stand and defend everybody in the Mi'kmaq nation. And obviously, as we combat colonization, it's really not just Mi'kmaq nation, it's all of our sister nations. And so I take so many lessons from everybody and all of the hardships that they faced, and they just kept going for us. And so that's why we keep doing it. And everything we do is a success, like everything. I think all of the resistance is a success.
Thank you so much, Pam. And I like that. I think that's going to be our next book, is What She Said. I think we need to, that's going to be the title of our next book. I can get all of these ladies on here to contribute. You can each write a chapter. But Courtney, for you, I'm sure you had a lot of struggles, and, you know, I was actually originally a film major, so I well understand how challenging it can be to pull together, especially a historical documentary like this. What was your strategies? And then maybe you could share a little bit of a hint on what your future projects are that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing also that popped in my mind with everyone speaking, I mean, Mary's story and drive, you know, echoes what everyone else is saying. You know, she saw this injustice with her family, with friends, and the women that she was meeting across the country. And she was just like, no, this can't continue. And I think her story and everyone here, again, just proves the impact that each one of us can make. You know, Mary didn't come from that political background, but she went into that space and she was herself, and she held true to her values, and with that same persistence that everyone and the love that everyone here has carried forward, you know, went decades and didn't back down. And I think that's what's important. And that's what we can learn from Mary 2X Earley and from everyone here, that we can make that change and we can bring those values back to our community. We can take on the government. For myself, the biggest challenge in making the film was the lack of archives. It took 4 years to make. And before the film, there was, I think, 3 images circulating on the internet. And now there's so many more because they're from the work that we've put into creating this film. And to me, that's a win, that Mary 2X Earley's story is accessible now, that it's coming out for free across Canada tomorrow on the NFB in 3 languages, including Kanien'kehá. You know, that's what's important. And that's what drove me. And I was able to connect again with women across the country who were giving tips about where to find some archives, or just wanting to share stories about Mary 2X Earley. So again, that let me know just how important her story is. Someone was sharing a story of, you know, meeting her 30 years ago, and that moment sticks out. So it's important to bring these stories forward and finding these little archives, you know, in Mary's family, and also that it was women as a whole who really kept the archives alive. Our institutions, our media outlets, it didn't really have it. So that was a struggle when there's key moments, key historical moments, and they threw these things away. It just shows, you know, who controls our history in this country, what they think is important. You know, if it was a politician, I'm sure right away that all would have been archived somewhere. But no, it was an Indigenous women's rights issue. And so that wasn't important to men overseeing the archives at the time. So I think that's the biggest issue, and why I'm so grateful that we have this film to celebrate Mary 2X Earley. And there's been so much great things after that. Like Google did a doodle on her. The World Book Encyclopedia has added an entry on her. So again, there's awareness, and that's the power that we have to make change.
And I think, you know, what you've brought here, Courtney, is so exciting. The end of those notions of those archives, as you said, you know, the men who were in charge of the history at the time. And that's why we are working on this Women's History Project. And so I really want to remind everybody, we're going to put a link in the chat to go to our Facebook page, check out what we're doing. And I ask you to help us move forward, because I can see a new project for Courtney. I've got lots of footage from all of these gatherings, and Senator Lillian, when she was here for our honorary degree, and Sharon and Jeanette. All I need is a director. And so if you've got a few spare hours in I have a future project for you, and for everybody else who's watching, if you have those photos somewhere, some picture of your great auntie or your mom, please reach out to the Women's History Project, share those with Courtney and I and all of our people here, so that we can bring that into our project to make sure that our Indigenous women's history is not just integrated. We want to be central to the, I mean, how can you not have Indigenous women's history as central to the Canadian Women's History Project? So we will really, really appreciate anybody who has any ideas, links where we can look, and some pictures in your granny's old photo albums. Please reach out and we will find a way that you can get them to us. As part of this, one of the other questions people have asked, now that we know that the law has changed in 2019, we know that there are a lot of people who have not yet been able to get their children and their grandchildren reinstated, reclaim their status. And as we've heard from these stories, this has caused a lot of struggle and a lot of strife and a lot of conflict in our communities, depending on what side people were taking on this. What can you recommend in terms of how we help our communities heal and come together as communities? We have a lot to heal from, coming together, we need detox centers. So how can we advocate for healing in our communities after these kinds of, I would say the government, deliberately turning our communities, turning our women, turning the communities against the women, instead of seeing our women as the center of our communities and the heartbeat of our nations and the center of our families, the way we have been since time immemorial, turning us into a burden, something that the First Nations don't want back, because they see their children and grandchildren as a burden instead of the assets that we know our women and our children are. I mean, if we don't have those future generations, nobody sits on their deathbed in the hospital saying, geez, I wish I'd spent a few more hours at overtime. They're sitting there thinking how grateful they are for our families and our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So any thoughts on how we can pull our communities back together and help with healing? Who'd like to start?
Well, I guess I will. Okay,
Jeanette and then Lillian, thank you.
Okay, since I'm the oldest one here. Okay,
that's fair.
When I look back and look right now at our communities, I am really happy that, all that opposition that we faced, where we were getting kicked out of meetings and we were getting sort of opposed at every corner that we wanted to go around, that it brought us together as women's organizations. So in 1972, we formed the Ontario Native Women's Organization, the Quebec Native Women, and that spread right across Canada. So those barriers had a positive outcome. And then we realized that once we were right across Canada, we were all sisters looking for that same action and that vision, which was to have that right to belong back to our community, to have that identity, and to be with our relatives, our friends, be buried with our ancestors, all that, we could do it. And if we did support each other. So I believe that was one real positive outcome of all those struggles. And those organizations are still there and they're still doing a lot of good. The other thing is now we can see where many of our people are looking at our own spirituality, getting back to our own connection to our lodges, our our own traditional teachings. And we are doing that within the Anishinaabe Nation. That really makes a difference. When you learn about your clans, you learn about your roles, your responsibilities, the key ones of love, respect, and bravery, honesty, all those beautiful teachings. And if we can start practicing all that within our communities, of course, it's going to be beneficial to everyone. It'll take us off that wrong path and put us back where we should be as we move forward. And you can see it. You go to the powwows, you go to any gathering, the women are there with their children and the young women are there with their babies. Everyone has our traditional regalia on, and any gathering, we see our women in their ribbon skirts, and we see all our young men with their long hair and their ribbon shirts. That's that sense of pride. And we also see a lot of our young people wanting to learn the language. We have a language commissioner within the Anishinaabe Nation, it's Barbara Nolan, and she keeps saying we have to push it. And because we don't want to see it disappear or die. You know, that's who we are, and we have to maintain it. We can't depend on someone else to keep our languages. We have to use it, and we have to hand it down to our young people. That balance, Josephine Ndam, the water walker, always talked about that balance between men and women. And as she looked at the environment and nature, there's that sense of balance there too. What's going to happen to this land if we don't have those teachings behind us, if we don't practice them? So I would like to say it will happen. And if any young people are listening, really explore, go back to your communities, find the elders, you know, find out about the language classes. They are there, they're being provided. All we have to do is go and do it. Someone said, just do it. Okay, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll get you a Nike t-shirt that says, just do it. That's, thank you. And Lillian, please.
Yes, thank you. It's actually a really interesting question, and two things came to my mind, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to explain it very well. But first of all, before the bill was passed, the government was, going to consult, right? They were going to consult whether or not this was the right thing to do. So they poured a lot of time and resources into it. They should be doing the same thing with regard to integrating and contacting people that are eligible. They should be pouring money into programs of public education and this whole concept of the right to belong. Because if you look at it across Canada, we talk about, and I'm sorry, I'm not a numbers person. We talk about the number of people living on reserve and the number of people living off reserve. Well, the off reserve population is big. It's over half of the total population, and it's going to get bigger. And that doesn't mean it's going to be worse. That just means it's going to be bigger. And so the two, we have to come together somehow and talk about the benefits to both. And I'm a member of the George Gordon First Nation, about an hour's north of Regina, here in Saskatchewan. And over the last few years, there's been more of an effort to involve off-reserve members on what's happening. So, I think individual reserves and First Nations are starting to think about it. And so, honestly, I think the government has to just, get with it and start providing money to support that talking again of on reserve and off reserve, because the off reserve are those of us who were, literally not allowed to grow up on the reserve, who don't know our culture. And so government has a role to play in this. We should be pushing them for it. And, you have allies in government, you have people in the House of Commons, and you have the Senate. And, having been in the Senate, I think we have some good Senate allies. And we, I know you've been continuing, Pam and Sharon, I know you've been continuing to talk with them, as have I. And we now have I think there's probably gone down from 12, but there's 10 to 12 Indigenous senators who are there from government to government. And I think we need to remember they're there and to utilize them. And I know they'd be happy to be utilized to advance this issue. And, you know, it's an important issue. And so I think there has to be money coughed up from the government. That's the least they can do. Okay.
Big wedge. And I think that's a really good message. You know, when we talk about that class action suit, when we talk about reparations for all of these people who have literally spent 50 years fighting for what is their birthright, you know, what they have lost in those 50 years, those who have lost their homes, those who have lost their land, that connection, although that can never be replaced in monetary ways, but in making a genuine investment in programs that will provide access to culture and language for our young people so that our young people can grow up strong with a sense of who they are and who our ancestors are in our culture. And Sharon or Pam, did you want to weigh in on this one?
Go ahead, Pam.
I always wait for Sharon first because she's my elder. So again, everything everybody said. And also, I guess I think about the whole decolonization process, the whole repairing from centuries of genocide process as one that's ongoing. So I always fear if people think that there's going to be like this point in time when everybody feels good enough that then we can deal with women back in our communities, you know? So I think we just have to take people where they are. We have to understand that some are going to agree with us and some are never going to agree with us because of their life experiences, because of the impacts of colonization. And I don't think we need to wait. You know, all of the things that people need to deal with the trauma is important, but at the same time, women shouldn't take a back burner and be excluded from their communities while people go through that process. It's kind of almost similar to like public education. So for years and years and years, you know, people always said the solution is public education. When everyone gets on side, then when we can talk about treaty rights and land rights and everything else. Well, first of all, the public isn't all going to be on side ever, even if every single person is publicly educated about Indigenous issues. And there's always a risk to waiting until a certain point in time, whatever it is, public education or, you know, people going through their own experiences, all of that stuff. I think we just, you know, we got here as a raggedy, taggedy bunch with all of the trauma and oppression and dispossession that has been on us as individuals, families, and communities. And I think we just need to keep pushing ahead. And for those that can participate because they're at that stage, that's great. And for those that can't, that's where they are right now. And we will just speak on their behalf and make sure that their rights are protected too. And, you know, we're just a great big bunch of, you know, mess from genocide, but the hope for the future is that we just still keep going in our own ways. And we might see empty seats at community meetings, but we are there for those people who can't quite participate right now.
And we got to start somewhere, right?
And that's a really good message, Pam, because that's been the mantra all the time is when we started, Jeanette, when we started, they say, okay, well, when we do this, then the male leaders said, okay, well, let's get self-government and then we'll talk about the women's issue. Actually, I think it was Ovid Mercredi that said that to me. So, you know, when we get self-government, then we'll talk about women's issues and that kind of thing. And we need to be there. I mean, maybe not us specifically, because some of us, Jeanette, will not probably be around for the next 50 years. But anyway, but our people like us, our counterparts, those youngsters coming behind that hopefully will learn, they need to be there before these really major decisions are made, because self-government is a lot more than just administering money. You know, it's making policies and stuff that go on in your communities and how you treat each other. We've been taught over the years to not like each other. You know, oh, well, Jeanette's out there. Well, who is she? Look at all the work that I've done, right? And, you know, who is she? Why do we need to talk about Jeanette? And then these are all the things I don't like about Jeanette. That's not a conversation I've ever had, but it's a conversation. Those conversations are out there. I can absolutely say that Pam is being vilified out there. I've had people tell me, well, you know what Pam Palmater does? And so I let them tell me. And then I say, well, you know, Pam Palmater is one of my good friends. So they don't, but I just want to know what they're saying. And I'll never tell you what they're saying. Don't ever ask me, because you don't deserve, and you don't have the right to know that, because it's not good stuff. But anyway, that's because of a whole lot of stuff that we've been taught. We've been socialized to beat up on each other instead of support each other. And, you know, I experienced it because I'm always really generous, and I've got 8 kids, and 3 were born to me, but I had just the blessing of getting more. And I do have the 8 that call me mom, but I do have a lot of youngsters. My oldest son turned 52. And so that generation of kids, when they were growing up, his friends, they still hug me on the street and that, because they would come into the home and a lot of good things would happen. And so my daughter is going to be 44 this year. Oh, no, 46 this year, my oldest daughter, but my baby is 24. And so I've got the 50-year-old generation and I've got the 20-year-old generation, and he would bring them home. They would come to eat. I drove home one day and I saw these 2 young guys going down the street, kids that, you know, were her, and I was positive they'd been in my refrigerator, because I was just pulling into my driveway and they were just out in front of my house, and I could see 2 things that they had that were definitely in my refrigerator, but before they got a hold of. But anyway, the village thing, you know, that, and I've gotten into difficulty, and I think I might have told a couple of you about this, not difficulty, but one young man came, and my son, they were about 12, and my son was doing his, doing the ortho stuff and that. And so he came and asked me if I would help him with his, and his teeth needed a lot of help. And so I said, okay, I'll talk to your dad. And I talked to his dad, and I said, okay, this is what you do, make an appointment, yada, yada, yada. And it never happened. So my son was already into his braces, and he came back and he said, well, can you help me? And I said, okay, I'll talk to your dad. But what I asked him, if I did it, I would do it, because if I got 1 going to the orthodontist, why not 2? And so we did a lot of work, and he couldn't get a dentist appointment in town, but so we had to get one out of town. And they charged a premium on top of whatever Indian Health paid. So that was fine. I paid it and that, and things were going well. And I pulled into the gas station. I'm not going to use any names. Pulled into the gas station, and I got out and I went in, because you need to give them information in there before you fill up. And so I came out, and she was not a very friendly woman to begin with, but she yelled at me from across the pump. Well, how much are my grandson? How much have you paid for my grandson's teeth? And I said, oh, Grandma, that's between your grandson and me. And then she got really mad and she said, well, he's not your kid, And I just smiled and I said, oh, Grandma, that next generation belongs to all of us. And she got in her car and she slammed the door and peeled out. So fast forward about a week and a half, and I go to the arena to watch the kids play hockey. He and my son were a really good hockey player. Well, who happens to be sitting right there when I went in is Grandma. And so I do what I always do when people try to get me upset with them. I walked over and I said, "Oh, Grandma, how are you today?" And she says, "Oh, I'm fine." And I didn't know what kind of response I was giving. She said, "Oh, I'm fine." And then she turned to her sister and she said, "Oh, sister, this is Sharon McIvor. She's grandson's other grandma." So all I'm saying is that that's the way we are. And so many of us have struggled a lot that we've forgotten that we should be allies. We should be, it's okay for 5 of us to take care of I've got a nephew that we needed to sort of rescue from his mom, and he's got 5 old ladies. They're all of us are well over 65. But we talked to him about it, and he said, you know, these old ladies have your back. You know, you're lucky to have us, because we made sure that Mom wasn't able to continue doing what she was doing, and we kept the tie. And then we looked at him and we said, and we're so lucky to have you. So, but all I'm saying is that we come from a group of people that care for each other, and we look out for each other. And if you need help, we'll be there. We won't enable you to do things you're not supposed to be doing. We keep you on the straight and narrow, and we've totally forgotten that. And so it's a big job because of our socialization. You know, they took us these big villages that interacted, lived together, and isolated us into single families that then start competing with each other. So I think that that's something that we've always got to keep on the forefront. And I always tell stories, usually on myself, sort of to make a point. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say, is that we are responsible for the next generations, as Mimi said when we started, that, you know, it's not okay, you know, your kid's in trouble, well, that's your problem. And for us, that was never happened. I know I've got nieces and nephews, and that are, if they fall off the straight and narrow path, they have a hard time. They'll bargain with their parent not to let me know. I'll do anything, Mom, anything, just don't tell Aunt Sharon. So anyway,
you know, they say, right, that it takes a village to raise a child, but I think it also takes an Indigenous woman to run a village.
For sure. Just put us in charge and things will go well, and everybody will be treated fairly. And
exactly.
So, yeah. So anyway,
Courtney, did you want to weigh in?
After that.
What she said. That's our next book.
I mean, maybe one thing to add about, you know, this path of healing, it is sharing story and valuing voice. Like for Mary Tuak's Earley, I was so fortunate for the film to have audio recordings of her that filmmaker Alamiso Bombsman had done. So the backbone of the film is Mary sharing her own story in her own words. And that's what we need to keep doing, is uplifting those voices and letting people speak for themselves and their own story and experience. And I think that, to me, is like the really touching and amazing part of this film, is that it's resonating with people. And whether it's been in in-person screenings or on social media, people are talking about their experiences now. And I think a lot of that was them connecting with Mary for the first time and kind of hearing about the work that all of you and all of these women have done to get our First Nations children and future generations where they are now. So that's something that I'm seeing happening, is that people are feeling comfortable to share their story of what happened to them, their mom, their grandmother, that it's been silenced so long within their own family, but they're somehow starting to feel this comfort. And that's part of sharing experience. We've been silenced for so long that this has been something shameful. And I think the more that we talk about it, we'll realize how many people have gone through these experiences and still are. And that's an important step to go forward. And, you know, I always say to everyone, just keep saying Mary Tuak's Earley's name, keep saying the name of all of you that are, you know, on this call today, and the work that, you know, Jeanette and Lillian, all of you that you've put in on this. It's incredible, and all of your names need to be known, and people need to keep saying that so we can celebrate those stories.
And I think it's those stories and giving that voice. And I agree with you, Sharon. I was actually advised, warned a couple of times not to invite Pam because it was going to upset people because she's an instigator. And I was like, oh, I'm raising extra money now just to make sure she comes, because that's exactly my kind of people. And we've been inspiring and instigating. And, you know, it takes that person with the courage to say the things that we all want to say, that we all want to, that need to be said. Sometimes we need to, you know, to call out and to really expose that injustice. You know, one of my staff here at Trent talks about how when we were little and there's, you know, monsters under the bed, and you light the flashlight and you look under there, it's that we can't chase away those monsters until we shine a light on them. And so that's why it's so critical to have people who have the courage to speak the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. There's, in fact, I'm sure every woman on this call right now has had that moment of being told to, you know, mind your business and go back to the kitchen. I remember still the chief in my community telling Mom, you just go back up to the high school and mind your own business up there. And so many, you know, none of this would have happened if any of you had listened to that kind of advice. And that's why I'm happy to invite Pam anywhere and to always participate in whatever she's up to, because we know it's going to be important and usually a lot of fun too. So we have a very specific question that I want to make sure we get time for some of those who might have some legal expertise. For young people who have lost their status due to child welfare, to the 60s scoop, things that, so they wouldn't be young people now, or even the millennium scoop, those who have lost their status in that way, is there somewhere they can reach out, or who would be advocating? How would they go about trying to get their status restored in those situations? Anybody? Do we have any ideas? Even who we reach out to?
The crucial piece is information. There's no way to register without finding a family tie somewhere. And I know I've spoken to at least a couple that just because of the circumstances were not able to find that tie. And but no, there isn't anything out there. You know, when we've been, Pam, when we've been on the call with the minister and we're trying to push them to start giving information out there. The other thing I asked about on one of the calls was they used to have what they called an A list at the department. And those were the kids that were adopted out when they knew that they had status, and they put their status on hold until they turned 18. So if you were a non-Indigenous couple or a non-status couple that adopted a status kid that was born with status, they wouldn't allow you to exercise that status until they were 18. They basically said, you've taken over this child, and so you're going to be responsible for them until they're 18. So they're not going to have any, well, what some call treaty rights, but rights. But they kept them on a list, and they would send a letter to the parent to say, your child is registered status Indian. Here's a number. When they get to be 18, send here and use this number, and we'll let them know where their band is and what their band number is. And as far as I know, they never it was never dealt with. I know there were legal cases that at first they just took the status away. And there was a case about an Indian child that said that because it's provincial, adoption is provincial legislation, and Indian status is federal legislation. The Adoption Act could not neutralize the status, but that's when they started the A list. And I know that I did inquire specifically for someone here. Is there an A list, especially of some of these older ones that they never exercised that number? Because a lot of the the white parents would throw it away. They didn't want their kid to have anything to do with being an Indian. And so is there a way for us to figure it out? And they would not answer. I could not get a response from them around the adoption, the A list, and are there still kids or adults now on that list that have never exercised, you know, the knowledge that they have status. So it's a hard question, but what you need to do is you've got to have information. As far as I know, there's no place to go besides the adoption agency or however they were adopted, or someone who knew who their parents were to even start the process.
Thank you. So this is going to be our last question. I can't believe we've already gone through 2 hours together. You women are so amazing. There's so many more questions and thoughts, but I'm going to try to wrap it up into one final question. So our final question will be, when we're thinking about all of the really critical issues, like the overcriminalization of Indigenous women or Indigenous people in general, you know, the impact of enforcing patriarchy in our communities, how to be a good ally if we're speaking out. What advice would you give to those next generations in terms of how to take on these issues, how to step up and be that warrior, whether you're a young Indigenous person, a young Indigenous leader, or a non-Indigenous ally? How can you step up? What is your best advice to step up? Because there's so many issues. How do we make a difference? I always teach everybody here that, you know, when they ask why I tell my mom's story, is it because I think she's great and I like to brag about her, which I do think she's great and I do like to brag about her, but that's really not. I have these stories because all of you women, and to my mom specifically, you're an example of how one person can make a difference by standing up and speaking out. One very small person stood up against the whole government of Canada. And even though it took 50 years and the support of all of these powerful women,
yeah,
you ladies all made a powerful difference in the lives of thousands and thousands of us, including Pam, including me, including, you know, half of the people down the hallway here that are literally just, every time I see them, they say, please tell your mom it's because of her that I got my status now. And so they're all so proud. So yeah, some fast final thoughts on advice for that next generation on what's our next challenge, how we can make a difference. And we'll start this time. We'll go backwards. Courtney we'll start with Courtney and then we'll circle back.
A very big question. Again, I think, you know, the best way also is to find the issue that you're most passionate about. Like you said, Dawn, there's so many overlapping ideas, challenges, or whatnot. And I think start with something that speaks to your heart. And that's what it was for me, Married to Wheatuk's early story and sex discrimination, and just seeing how it's impacted our communities. Like that for me was an issue that I wanted to talk about. And my way was through art and through visual storytelling. But there's so many different ways that people can get involved. You know, someone might be good at writing, someone might have really amazing contacts to get to an MP or podcasting. Again, the arts, there's tons of ways to be involved with an issue. And I'd say, you know, one of the best ways, like I already said, was just the names of everyone that you're seeing today. Remember their names, say all these Indigenous women's names. And I think that's the best way that we can go forward to start talking about these issues.
I'll move to Lillian. And you're on mute still.
Okay. I agree with what Courtney has said. I think there's so many issues, and certainly in my own lifetime, and even in the Senate, I tried to limit myself to 4, but it really, you had to boil down to one or two. And it's the same thing. It's those things that just speak to you and drive you, and you'll meet other people that have the same kind of drive. You'll meet other women in the community when you go to community events. So for example, here in Saskatoon in 2005, it was like kind of spontaneous. We had a group of women from all over the city that came together to work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that was in response to the disappearance of a 5-year-old Indigenous girl in Regina, Tamara Keepness. She still hasn't been found. And it was that event that just sort of drew us all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous women, together. And that group is still going to this day. So just, it's going to happen if it's going to happen. And just follow your heart, and, also follow your brain, and you'll get into the right spot to start to make a difference.
Go ahead. And Sharon.
My history is really interesting because I've touched on one of the big things, of course, is the discrimination in the Indian Act, but I also sat on the task force into federally sentenced women when they had one prison in Kingston, and they wanted to know what to do about it. And I ended up sitting on that task force as well, and chaired a committee that built the first healing lodge in Canada. And so again, a lot of my stuff was just interest, and I agree with Lillian that that's one thing that they should, look and see what you can do. But I also, in the early 90s, there was a group of us that led the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And we took that internationally. So I can't, in good faith, tell people to pick one subject because I've worked on a lot of them. And then of course I've also been into the courts. I've been to the Supreme Court of Canada several times as a plaintiff and as a lawyer on a case, and at least 3 of the cases that I argued, it ended up having to change the law. So just go with it. I know a lot of times the non-Indigenous women that worked with us really early on, they would get shut down right away. They'd go and give a presentation for us because we were spread so thin. The first thing you do is you'd get, at a university, you'd get an Indigenous woman professor getting up and saying, "Who are you to speak for Indigenous women?" So one thing I did with my non-Indigenous allies is I say, if anybody ever asks you, who are you to speak? And when I was with the Native Women's Association of Canada, and I say, tell them your Native Women's Association of Canada sent me and told me what to say. And I say, I'll give you my personal permission. You go and you speak. So Sharon McIvor said I could speak on their behalf. But, it's a way that a lot of people that don't like what we're saying will try to shut you down. And you've got to not allow that to happen, our non-Indigenous allies. And but yeah, just go for it. We need a lot of them. Come and go to Ryerson and get into one of Pam's classes, or come to NBIT and get in one of my classes. Go to Trent and get into one of Dawn's classes. That's where I've got activists coming out of NBIT left and right because they happen to take a class or 2 or 3 or 4 of mine, because once they get one, they'll register for whatever other one I'm teaching, regardless whether it gives them credit to the right place or not. So that's what I would suggest. Do a lot of reading. and it is scary. It is scary to be yelled at and to try to be shut down. I've had that happen with several of the Grand Chiefs of the AFN. And I was always very polite, but they never stopped me from saying what I wanted to say or what needed to be said. So, and we've got a lot of young women that are out there and they like themselves and they're going to go and do this kind of work.
Miigwech, Sharon. And Pam.
Well, I think for Indigenous people, for Native women, do what your passion is and don't be so hard on yourself when in the moment, maybe you're raising 4 small babies and you're taking care of your grandparents and you're volunteering in your community. You know, that's a contribution too. You don't have to be in the media. You don't have to be in the courts. You don't have to be on the front lines of, you know, land defense. That, like, there's so much that contributes to our nations, and never undervalue that. The sister that babysits your kids so that you can go and do advocacy work, that's a warrior too. And so understand all of that. It is important. And you know, if you do want to pick up something specific to be an advocate on, do something that you're passionate about, and also don't assume you have to do everything, because many of us try to do everything because we see there's so much to be done, and that's really difficult. It can weigh really heavy. And for all of our non-Indigenous friends, allies, family members, and supporters, you know, everything that everyone said, self-educate, do whatever you can to be constantly learning about these issues, and then follow the lead of Indigenous women. You know, there's a lot of support you can do. There's a lot of heavy lifting you can do behind the scenes. You don't always have to be in the front. For example, I'm sure people don't see Sheila Day all the time, or Gwen Brodsky, or Constance McIntosh, or the many, many non-Native women who are working day and night to help support what it is that we're doing. And they purposely take a back seat because they're following the lead of Indigenous women and trying to carry some of the heavy load while letting us lead the way. And I think that's a perfect union. And I think for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working together as allies, we have to understand, you know, as a family, we're going to have some bumps. There's going to be some trials and tribulations in the relationship. We're not going to get it all right away, and we're all learning how to do this together, but that's okay. That's what families do. We work it out, and then we just work for the bigger picture, because we're effectively all doing that, whether we're Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, you know, women's groups in Canada, anti-poverty groups. We're all working towards social justice and earth justice. And I think if we can just see it like that and strip away all the politics, we got it.
Absolutely. And Jeanette, your words of wisdom for those next generations.
Well, all I can say is all of what they say. Because you can hear all that passion, and that's what we need, you know. Yeah. And excellent. I don't believe I could say anything else other than I'm counting on all of you and your influence on those next generations to come. Excellent. I am so impressed and so pleased to have you all as my friends. Mm-hmm. And as I said, I'm counting on all of you doing what you're doing. Miigwech.
Thank you. And I think tonight, you know, based on what Pam was saying, the importance of those allies, I want to take this opportunity to thank groups like FAIA, who, you know, gave us a seat, dragged me along, helped with this speech, you know, 6 o'clock in the morning, we're meeting at coffee shops, just, you know, to make sure we had an opportunity as Indigenous women to have our voices heard, to have a seat at those tables. The same thing for the Canadian Research Institute on the Advancement of Women, who has given us a seat at the table, given us their seat at the table sometimes. And we can't thank you enough to all of our critical allies. Jackie, I know you're on here somewhere, and we really, really appreciate you supporting this event here tonight. And the board, all of my fellow board members at the Women's History Project who had faith in me, and Deborah, who has the patience of Job for dealing with me as we dragged this right to the last minute, but what turned into an absolutely phenomenal event. And Trent University for helping to sponsor, being one of our key sponsors here tonight, to bring this forward. And, you know, maybe I'll ask them, they should sponsor co-teaching a course. I think a course with Pam and Sharon and I've got my first 3, you know, guest speakers, guest lecturers at our course here.
Yeah.
If we could find a way to get it cross-listed at all of our institutions, I think we would have a lot of people signing up. Just tonight's session is a powerful example of all the really great conversations we could have. So I think everybody is there. Yep.
I just want to take the opportunity while we're here to also say I recognize Sheila and Gwen, you know, because I really needed them many times and they were always there for us. So miigwech, both of you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to everyone. Yeah. Yeah. How miigwech.
Yeah, a big, very, very big words of love, sending love to Sheila and Gwen. And to Yvonne Bedard, we want to acknowledge that she couldn't be here with us. She's in the spirit world just fairly recently. That very honored to at least be able to, she did get a chance to come at our gathering when we got together and tell her story. So we will be able to make sure that her story lives on in her memories and the power of what she did. And at our next one, we'll make sure that we have it at a time when Sandra Lovelace can be involved and bring it as well too. It just didn't quite work out for this one, but it's all the more reason to do it again. I think.
And Lynn Gale too, we should recognize.
And Lynn Gale as well. Yes, absolutely. Lynn Gale for bringing forward and being one of those champions. So there's so many more voices. This is just the first of many of these conversations. I thank everybody for coming out tonight. And I want to give all my love to everybody on this call. Thank you, ladies, for coming and joining and being that inspiration, being my mentors and my heroes, and to all of the young people who are watching the way you've led and are, you know, we can only hope to follow in your footsteps. I remember being in New York.
And miigwech to all of you for your birthday wishes.
Yes, happy birthday, Jeanette. So we're going to do one thing as we sign out. I don't know if everybody's done a waterfall. So we're going to take 1 minute to type in your birthday message, and then you don't hit send until I say send. So that's how we're going to close off. You can put your thanks in your birthday messages. So you can start typing now. You have 1 minute to type in your thank yous and then when I say go, will you hit send? So take a minute to type in the birthday messages, and we'll make sure that Annie and all of our backgrounds staff are making sure this is recorded so that we'll be saving these stories and making sure that those who weren't able to come will be able to hear these stories and these important words.
Okay.
Okay, you've got another 30 seconds to get your message typed in.
Well, look at them.
All right, and hit send, everybody. Miigwech to everybody for coming out tonight, to all of our supporters.